After being adopted in the early 70s, Amber Dawn Lee experienced an unorthodox childhood. Her parents, once freewheeling hippies, suddenly found religion and joined the Mormon Church, then veered away from the faith, taking young Amber and her sisters with them.
My parents started moving towards the more extreme fundamental groups. They were looking for something that was true to them, for a place to belong. They were really just kind of like cult jumping.
But as Amber's father grew ever more radical, he began having trouble at work.
My dad started having a harder time holding down a job, and he became paranoid. My parents' financial situation started getting worse and worse. Everything became really chaotic.
Finally, the worst happened. The family became homeless.
We lost our house, and something within me knew at that moment that everything in my life was going to change. At that point, we lived in a lot of different places. We lived in the woods in a tent for a while.
They started living out of the car or out of a storage unit, looking for food out of trash cans, not knowing when or where the next meal was coming from.
Amber hated it. She was really upset and, wanted to run away.
I knew something was really wrong. I didn't want to eat out of a dumpster. I didn't want to struggle for survival with my parents anymore. Nothing felt solid and secure.
So in the early 80s, after 2 rootless years, Amber was relieved when her father moved the family to a stable community in Ogden, Utah. It was a polygamous fringe group called the Zion Society, but to Amber, it was the promised land.
The Zionist Society was a new, up-and-coming splinter group in this little small cul-de-sac neighborhood, and everything about the group seemed to be perfect. The children had their hair curled in pretty little dresses.
Every blade of grass was perfectly cut. Every flower was perfectly placed. It really was lush and beautiful.
And for good reason. The shepherd of these pastures was former landscaper turned self-proclaimed prophet, Arvin Shreve.
Arvin looked like a normal person that you would see on the street. Short glasses, just a kind of a normal looking guy, I guess.
Arvin Shreve looked like this kindly grandfather, this little roly-poly old man with a kind, gentle face.
You wanted his attention, you wanted him to like you because he just seemed very contained and in charge. He had a demeanor of knowledge. Everything had order. There was nothing off schedule. It was really comforting that somebody would tell me what I was supposed to do next.
For young Amber, the newfound stability was a dream come true.
If you go from homeless to all of a sudden you're in a house, there's a lot of food to eat, then you're happy. When new families would come in, they would separate the family right away and put each girl or each boy in a council. So I was put into the Arvin Shreve Council, which meant that I was going to be his wife when I came of age.
To prepare for her role, Amber was assigned a mentor, a woman named Sharon Kapp.
Sharon Kapp was the head of one of the sister councils and had a lot of control over a lot of the women and children.
Sharon was one of Arvin's wives. Arvin trusted her. When I was with Sherry, I felt very safe because she's close to the prophet. Sharon taught that it was a really good thing to keep Arvin happy.
And one thing that made the prophet happy was attractive female followers.
We all had to stay really thin and up to the approval of the prophet. The women would weigh in so that they could keep at a certain weight. But there were other things that began making Amber uneasy. For starters, it had become hard to see her parents. One afternoon, I started walking around the corner to where my parents were staying, which was 3 houses away. The adults stopped me, like, "Where are you going?" I'm like, "I'm gonna go say hi to my mom." And they're like, "No, you can't. It's not on your schedule to see your mom today."
But the biggest surprise came when the ladies of Zion introduced a new clothing style to Amber.
I was part of the sewing team, so I would go and spend a few hours every day sewing.
Amber and the other children within these groups, they would be sewing lingerie.
I thought I was just sewing for, sisters or friends. I had no idea that we were doing it as a business. They were actually selling them to the local strippers.
But this was more than just a micro-enterprise. Skimpy garments suddenly turned up in Amber's dresser.
When I opened up my drawer, there were lines of panties, all perfect and frilly. My parents would always teach us about modesty. And then in this group, the panties were lacy with little words like naughty written on them. And it was like, why do we get these grown-up panties as kids?
Still, for an innocent girl who craved nice things, it didn't quite cross the line.
I was a little bit nervous, but I was a little bit excited. Everything matched, and it was really pretty. I was still the little girl that was looking at the lace and the colors, not the strings that were really behind it.
But soon the strings began to pull.
Sherry Cap would dress all of us children in lingerie, me and like a 3-year-old and my other friends who were 12, and they would teach us how to put on lingerie shows.
And the modeling took an unmistakably dark turn.
They would call in Arvin, and we would perform for the prophet. I knew then that something just is not right. I was told not to tell my parents what was going on. It was because they said my parents were not yet at the stage that I was, spiritually, that I had evolved, so I got to learn more.
But Amber's parents did become suspicious, and their attempts to protect their girls would leave a family torn in two.
She had chosen the evil she knew versus the evil she didn't.
And when the compound's front door slammed shut, true darkness descended.
I was beyond tearful. I was just numb. When the alarms went off, it was like all hell broke loose.
In the mid-1980s, young teen Amber Dawn Lee was growing uneasy in the Zion society. She had just been forced to model racy lingerie for the so-called prophet Arvin Shreve. It didn't seem right, but Amber was too grateful for the stability at Zion to rock the boat.
I wasn't afraid that we weren't going to have dinner. I wasn't afraid that I wouldn't have anything to wear. And I felt protected and taken care of.
Geez, just always wanted some semblance of a normal life, to have a house and some kind of balance.
So Amber was horrified when she heard her father risk everything one day by arguing with the prophet.
I was in my house when I heard my dad yelling, "You get her out here," and that I was his daughter and that Arvin had no right to keep me there. And I went out the front door, and my dad was in the street, and my younger sisters were in the car. My dad was very suspicious about something going on, and he packed up, like in that moment. Alarms were going off. Men came running from every direction towards my dad, surrounding him, and they were like, "You better get out of here, you better get out of here." It was a really, really scary thing for me. I didn't want my dad hurt.
Amber faced her biggest crossroads.
Basically, at that point, I could have run to the car and say, "I'm leaving with my parents," but I didn't want to struggle for survival with my parents anymore.
So she told them to go, and reluctantly they did.
Amber watched as her father drove away.
I was beyond tearful. I was beyond fainting. I was just numb. When I woke up the next day, it was taboo for me to talk about my parents. It was as if they never existed.
Amber Amber had to go on, so she focused on her routine and swallowed her pain. But as Amber buckled down, Zion handed her a new priority.
After my family left, they became more brazen. They started grooming me to become a wife of Arvin Shreve.
Most religious groups prepare young women for family life, someday. But at Zion, the lessons began fixating on filth instead of faith.
Sharon was in charge of teaching all of the young girls and the children the SWOL, which was the acronym for the sexual way of life. It was her job, given to her by the prophet and by God, to teach sexuality to everyone else.
And Sharon's teaching methods were a little unorthodox. She and her sisters would entice the children into playing games. But these were no ordinary games.
You'd have this game called Rape in the Dark, where basically instead of truth or dare, it was just dare, where people were told to have some sort of a sexual relationship with somebody that was in the room at the time.
The women in the group were all ages, and you would see a 70-year-old woman holding hands with a 16-year-old girl.
The girls were told to practice things like French kissing with one another.
It's really just extreme sexuality. It became such a part of every single thing within the group that all of a sudden I didn't feel comfortable in my own skin.
Amber tried to keep in mind that Arvin and Sharon knew God's plan.
There were eternal companions for Arvin that were older. And then I thought, well, someday I'm gonna, be his favorite wife.
But then someday came a lot sooner than she expected. One by one, Amber's young friends were sent to the prophet.
They would fix them all up and push them out across the street to Arvin's.
Then it was Amber's turn to cross the street.
I was trying to prove myself to them. If I was thrown out at that point, where would I go? My family was already gone. I was on my own.
And Sharon had trained her well.
Arvin was somebody that I loved and feared at the same time. So when it was time going across the street, it was like going down the aisle. I was going from one life into another. And once I crossed that street, then my innocence would be forever gone.
That night, Amber became prey for Zion's man of prayer.
Arvin Shreve raped me, and he hurt me. But I felt like my innocence had already been taken a long time before that actual night happened. The months of training and brainwashing, I think that actually did so much damage. It was almost like I just wanted it to get over with.
But Arvin's rapes continued. Amber tried to distract herself with tasks and routine, but she couldn't escape the hard life she saw stretching out ahead of her.
I'd been raped. I'd been working really hard, and I was not feeling any joy. It was just do what you're supposed to do.
But just a few months later, Amber's life changed dramatically once again.
Somebody came running into the house saying, "Social services is here, and they're here for you."
It turned out Amber was not forgotten when her parents left Zion.
I don't know how the discussions went down, but somebody had told me, "You need to pack and go."
Authorities had come to return her to her family. No one knew who had sent them, but Amber was too relieved to ask questions.
I was excited and scared at the same time because I didn't want anybody in the group to think that I wanted to go. And all along hoping that social services actually had the power to take me.
Social services got no resistance from Arvin. Amber was handed over quickly and quietly. But after spending her formative years at Zion, Amber now faced an alien world.
I was caught up in a tornado of darkness.
And as she struggled to find her footing, Zion's walls were about to crumble.
The raid was out of this world.
Nobody had any idea what was really going on.
They thought it was a fortress, but the walls were coming down.
In the mid-1980s, social services had removed Amber Dawn Lee from Zion and from the clutches of so-called prophet Arvin Shreve. No one would ever know who had called authorities, but one thing Amber did know was that she was ready to see her family again, until her hopes were crushed.
I was taken to New Mexico because that was the last known place of where my parents lived, but they were not there anymore.
With no parents to claim her, Amber went into a succession of foster homes as she entered public school.
It was really scary going into high school for the first time. I was not socially normal. I didn't know how to do any of the schoolwork. I didn't know some of the basic things, like really people went to the moon. I was an observer. I would just watch what everybody else was doing and try to fit in. I didn't tell anyone, not one person, where I came from.
The strain of hiding her past and the turmoil of foster care took their toll on Amber. She dropped out of school and hit the skids.
I was stuck in the underworld, really caught up in a tornado of darkness and doing drugs so that I could numb myself from thinking or remembering or anything.
Meanwhile, back in Utah, Ogden police had been watching Arvin and his Zion cult. And Arvin finally made a mistake.
Arvin Shreve brought in a divorced woman and a young child, and the father wanted to make sure that his child was safe. The man hired a private investigator, claimed that she was in the business of buying lingerie. She was able to get this amazing video of these 13-year-old girls to 40-year-old women modeling see-through lingerie.
It was the smoking gun investigators needed.
On August 2nd, 1991, law enforcement raided the Zion Society. They took adults into custody, and then they took the children into foster care.
As Zion crumbled, evidence mounted.
You had people coming forward saying that these children were being groomed to sexually satisfy Arvin Shreve and other adults within the Zion Society.
Investigators found over 750 instances of ritual child sex abuse at Zion. The cult's youngest victim was only 3 years old. With no hope of acquittal, Arvin Shreve and sidekick Sharon Kapp both plea bargained. Each got 20 years in prison.
It's a good thing to know that Arvin Shreve is not able to hurt anyone again, because what he did was absolutely monstrous.
But when the news of Zion's fall reached still struggling Amber, she was stunned.
The raid to me was really something out of this world. I couldn't even believe it. These people that I had been so close to for so long were going to be spending the rest of their lives in prison. It was unreal to me.
But the news was real, and as she absorbed it, Amber saw just how serious Arvin and Sharon's crimes had been. With the help of therapy, she realized how those crimes had shaped her own path.
I had to really take a good look at what my life was and why I had lived the life I had. And I really had to figure out my next steps. I stopped using drugs. I went to college and found just a normal life that didn't revolve around being numb.
Though Amber found her footing, Arvin Shreve left her with serious scars.
Arvin Shreve raped me. I have nights when I can't go to sleep, and that's a result of laying next to Arvin, not wanting to move because I don't want him to wake up, not wanting to go to sleep because then I won't be in control. So it never leaves you.
Despite her scars, today Amber enjoys a healthy life. She moved to LA for a career in acting and filmmaking. She found love and married a real husband.
He turned out to be a really stand-up guy. He loved me until I learned how to love myself.
It's been this slow process of saying, hey, I am going to be there for you, and this is real.
She's also reconnected with her family.
I love Amber very much. She's following her dream, no matter what's happened to her. I'm pretty proud of her for that.
There's still moments of certain things that remind me of my past, but then I stop and breathe and keep going forward. Life has completely turned around for me.
In the summer of 1995, 18-year-old Lisa Jefferson was a young mother in transition. After ending a relationship with the father of her 2-year-old son, she made the tough call to move from Texas back to her hometown of Syracuse, New York, for a fresh start.
I think it was a lot that I was missing my family. They were everything to me. Then I had my grandmother on the phone saying, come home to grandma so that I can take care of you. And I had to make a decision. It was not an easy thing.
Lisa's grandmother welcomed her and her son Carlos Jr. into her home with open arms.
I'm starting over again, but I'm happy to start over again. I was focused on how I was going to rebuild my life with my son.
But there were plenty of men whose sole focus was on her. And one in particular, Cecil Torrance, a neighbor in Lisa's apartment complex, was determined to make an impression.
Cecil was a very handsome guy. Now, he was tall, he was dark, he was such a charming guy, but I wasn't looking to get into another relationship really fast, and I just wanted to be kind of free.
Cecil just kept wanting to get a date. He would do anything that she wanted to do just to, to grab her attention.
But after several weeks of casual flirting, Lisa finally gave in to Cecil's advances and was pleasantly surprised.
He would always take me out to eat, and we'd have good conversation. He was definitely rough around the edges, and I kind of liked it. Nobody was going to push him around.
Cecil worked in construction and had 2 little girls of his own. Even though they lived with his ex, he seemed to be just as devoted a parent as Lisa. Soon, Cecil and Lisa became more than just friends.
I fell head over heels for him. People knew that was Cecil's girl, and it kind of made me feel important.
It all happened really fast. He treated her like a princess.
When Lisa landed a job at a department store, it seemed like life was going her way.
And I started to say, okay, girl, you got the looks, now you got the man. You can provide for your child, and the confidence definitely started to grow.
And in April of 1996, when Lisa discovered she was pregnant with a boy, she was overjoyed by Cecil's excited reaction to the news.
Cecil said, we're going to be a family. We're going to bring Carlos Jr., and we're going to move in together. We were picking out colors together and just high anticipation of the birth of his first boy.
On Christmas Day of 1996, Lisa and Cecil received a very special delivery, Cecil Jr. Lisa thought she had it all. Unfortunately, her family thought otherwise.
Once she had the baby and they moved in together, I think that's when all the change came. The not going out, the not being around the family, and you gotta cook and clean, and everything has to be ran accordingly. I didn't like that at all.
Cecil was a very jealous guy. One time a coworker invited me and a couple other girls to her house for dinner. He called my phone about 50 million times while I was there, arguing with me about something that was so minute. I couldn't understand it, but then it clicked to me. Cecil is very insecure.
So when Lisa got home, she assured Cecil that she only had eyes for him, and that seemed to do the trick.
He's apologizing. He's sorry. I love you. Just stay home with me.
In those moments, Lisa fell in love with her man all over again, despite her family's disapproval.
I loved Cecil. I loved him. I loved our family. I loved the life that we were trying to build. And I wanted the American dream.
In the summer of 1999, Lisa Jefferson and her boyfriend Cecil Torrance were enjoying watching their blended family grow.
We actually moved into a new place. Carlos Jr.'s in school now, and I found a new job at a customer service company, and so everything's going good.
And Cecil's jealous tendencies had all but disappeared. He was quite the doting dad.
Cecil would watch the boys while I was at work. Cecil was an excellent father.
And when Cecil landed a construction job with potential for growth, the young family was on their way.
Cecil was getting paid a lot of money. I'm feeling good about myself. He's feeling good about himself. We're a little power couple. There was just that one piece missing. I wasn't Mrs. Torrance.
So in the summer of 2001, after adding their second baby boy to the blended family, the couple decided it was time to make their union official. In the fall of 2001, Lisa walked down the aisle and into the arms of her adoring Cecil.
It wasn't a big, extravagant wedding, but it was a very beautiful, beautiful day. I was over the moon.
He was happy, she was happy. They looked great together.
Life was good for the newlyweds, until 2 months later when Cecil suddenly lost his job.
Cecil started to change when he got laid off.
But while Cecil struggled to find work, Lisa excelled at her job and was promoted to the HR department of her company.
It definitely gave me a different sense about who I was. I started to really become very confident. I started to recognize that I am very smart, bright, and I can be a very independent woman.
But Lisa started to notice that the better she did, the worse her new husband was doing.
And after applying over and over again at different organizations and getting no feedback, I think it just killed his spirits. And that's when everything started going downhill. He's staying out very late at night, coming in at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, drunk. It started to really, really affect our relationship.
One day in January of 2003, Cecil took his drunken debauchery too far.
Cecil comes home at 5 o'clock in the morning with friends. They're drinking, they're kind of loud. I'm upset. I look at Cecil, I said, what's going on here? Well, what are you doing? And he's like, oh, just go to bed, babe. Everything's gonna be fine. They'll be out of here in a little while. I wake up to Cecil passed out drunk and his pager's going off. So I decided that, okay, it must be important. Let me call this person back. I ended up calling the number back and it was a female's voice.
Lisa was furious, and for once, she demanded to know where Cecil had been. And that's when Lisa's husband exploded with a fury she had never seen before.
He grabbed me by my hair and he started punching me in my face. I was scared and I couldn't get away from him. There was nowhere for me to run. There was nowhere for me to hide. And he wouldn't stop. I'm begging him to please stop. You're gonna kill me. He didn't care.
Cecil finally relented and left the room. Lisa quickly called 911. Cecil spent the next 2 days in jail, while Lisa stayed with family, nursing 2 black eyes and a fractured nose.
I couldn't believe it. He came across as a kind person. He didn't give off any indication that he was just a volcano ready to erupt.
Lisa pressed charges, and Cecil was ordered to attend 6 months of counseling. 1 week later, when Lisa returned home to pick up a few necessities, Cecil was waiting and singing a different tune.
He was begging and pleading and crying, and I'm like, no, no, no. Look what you did to me. How could I come back to you? He's like, I was drunk and, I didn't know what I was doing. I love you. I'm going to counseling now, crying.
Horrified by the violence Cecil had shown, Lisa was prepared to walk away. But the thought of breaking up her family was too painful to bear.
I didn't want to be a single mother. My mom was a single mother. I want my boys to have something I didn't have, which is a father and a mother in the same household.
So Lisa felt compelled to give her family a second chance.
He went to counseling where he learned about empathy, what triggers him to become this way. He did great, and everything started to get on the right path.
He showed her he could be the perfect man for her and her kids.
Lisa was happy to put the ugly chapter behind them and plan for the family's future. But Cecil had plans of his own.
The violence certainly escalated, and it led to the worst act that you could imagine.
And before Lisa could see the truth hiding behind his sinister eyes, her world would change forever.
As blood splattering everywhere, I just knew that would be my last time here on Earth.
In the summer of 2005, after her husband Cecil went through counseling for striking her, Lisa Torrance decided to give him one more chance for the sake of their kids.
He was going to be a better husband to me in every way, shape, or form.
And even though Cecil had failed to land a job, it seemed he'd found his true calling at home.
Cecil would clean the house, prepare meals. He would do the boys' homework with them, wash clothes. He was an all-around Mr. Mom.
And Cecil had started making a name for himself as a winning coach on his boys' basketball and football teams.
He took a lot of pride in coaching his kids and the community's kids. People liked Cecil. They wanted their kids to be on Coach Cecil's team.
Life in the Torrance household was better than ever, especially when Lisa was able to buy her family a new home.
She was living the American dream. She was married, she had a family, she had a beautiful home, she had nice cars in the driveway, bank account. Everyone looked at their life as a fairy tale.
And on June 4th, 2007, the family was thrilled to welcome a third son into the world. But what should have been a time for celebration became quite the opposite.
He was still not able to find work, and my career was just blossoming, and Cecil's not happy, arguing with me all the time about where I'm wanting to go, who I'm wanting to go with. His control was at an all-time high.
Lisa had been down this road before with disastrous consequences and was not about to do it again. But she had her family and her future to think about. So in 2008, Lisa went to work on herself.
I started going to the gym. I lost tons of weight. I decided I was going to go back to school to work towards getting my degree. My job is going well. I have my home. The boys are good. Everything is good besides my marriage.
By the summer of 2009, Lisa had found her stride, but Cecil didn't exactly embrace her newfound independence.
He's coming into bars where I told him I was gonna be, and he's making scenes. He's going through all of my social network applications.
That took a toll on her. She just basically got tired of being underneath his thumb.
I was not gonna allow him to control me any longer. I was done.
So on February 28, 2010, Lisa packed up the kids and headed to her friend's house, bracing herself for Cecil's reaction. But surprisingly, a week later, Cecil called and agreed their marriage was over.
Cecil was very calm, and he said to me, I know that we're breaking up. I know that the marriage is done. He just wanted me to bring his children back home for these next couple days so that he could spend time with his boys before he actually had to leave the household. And I agreed to come back.
But Lisa made it very clear to Cecil she was there for the sake of the children, not for him.
When I came back, I was very cold, very withdrawn from him, and we weren't, really talking.
The following morning of March 4th, 2010, Lisa got her oldest boys off to school as usual.
I take my 2-year-old and I sit him on the bed, and I go into the bathroom. I put my cell phone on the counter, I take off my robe, and I get into the shower and I close the glass doors.
But nothing could have prepared Lisa for what would happen next.
Cecil comes in, closes the door behind him. He slides the glass door to the side. and he points a black handgun in my face.
On the morning of March 4th, 2010, Lisa Torrance was begging for her life as her husband Cecil pointed a gun in her face.
I'm scared. I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, he's gonna kill me.
Lisa was paralyzed by fear, knowing their 2-year-old son was in the next room.
Cecil pistol whipped me, and he shatters the shower glass doors, blood splattering everywhere.
Cecil pummeled his wife for the next 30 minutes until their toddler knocked on the door.
And he starts saying, Mommy, Daddy, open the door. So I'm yelling, Mommy loves you.
Heartbroken and focused on her children, Lisa pleaded with Cecil as a parent.
I said, what about our kids? If I'm dead, what about our kids? I won't tell the police. And he says to me, are you crazy? Then he shot me. I felt my left femur bone being shattered. And he shot me again. I'm yelling, please, oh my God, I'm in so much pain.
Cecil shot his wife 4 times before grabbing her cell phone and fleeing with their 2-year-old son. He had left the mother of his children to die, but Lisa was dead set on staying alive.
I said to myself, if you're gonna die, you're gonna die trying to live. So I managed to crawl out of the tub. I couldn't walk, so my leg was dangling. I crawled down the first flight of stairs. I was in so much pain, so much pain. And then I crawled down the second flight of stairs. At this point in time, I'm in and out of consciousness.
After dragging her mangled body out of the house, Lisa collapsed in her yard. Minutes later, her neighbor discovered her and called 911. With Lisa's life hanging by a thread, word of the horrific early morning attack started to spread.
Next thing I know, my cousin nudges me. He says, get up, wake up. And he said, he shot her. Cecil shot Lisa. And I ran out the room, repeating what he said. Cecil shot my sister. Cecil shot my sister. It killed me.
Lisa was rushed to the hospital while police searched for Cecil Torrance and their 2-year-old son.
There was no question they considered Cecil armed and extremely dangerous. There was concern over the safety of the children.
Police canvassed the area and discovered that Cecil had taken his youngest son to his mother's house before going into hiding.
When the police responded to Cecil's mother's house, their 2-year-old son was taken to the youth division of the Syracuse Police Department for safety, just in case Cecil had further contact with the mother.
While police pounded the pavement in search of Cecil, Lisa awoke from her 5-hour surgery to utter chaos.
My family members were coming in and, they had tears in their eyes. And I have detectives in my room. I'm in the hospital under an alias. People are, scared for my children because they're afraid that he might try and come and kidnap them, maybe take them as a hostage.
I was scared. The hospital was on lockdown because they didn't want him to come in and try to finish the job.
After an exhaustive 30-hour manhunt, police received an anonymous tip about Cecil's whereabouts.
Cecil was apprehended at a friend's house. And the police found him hiding under a pile of clothes in a closet.
When I found out Cecil was arrested, I felt relieved. It felt like the boogeyman was gone. And with the help of God, I took everything in me and I fought hard for my life.
After 6 days in the hospital and 4 months in rehabilitation, Lisa made a full recovery. On February 14, 2011, Cecil Torrance pled guilty to second-degree attempted murder and was later sentenced to 18 years in jail.
I was happy. I knew that this was the start of a brand new Lisa, because I was one of the lucky ones. There's a lot of people who don't make it out.
Today, Lisa now recognizes Cecil for the troubled man that he was.
I never viewed myself as a victim because it was happening so far and few in between. No one could have never, ever told me that he would try and take my life from me.
It wasn't her time to go. She was determined to live. He just made her stronger.
Now Lisa volunteers with a local agency dedicated to helping victims of domestic violence.
I try and reach young kids who are going through things like that and get them to understand that, you know what, just because he says he loves you doesn't mean that he won't hurt you.
August 15th, 1975. Marple Township, Pennsylvania. The morning sun is a heavy, golden weight, pressing down on the quiet suburban streets of Delaware County. It is the kind of heat that sticks to your skin, the kind of day where the air itself feels thick with the hum of cicadas and the distant drone of lawnmowers. In the mid-70s, this was a place of ironclad safety, a landscape of manicured lawns, station wagons, and the unshakable belief that evil lived somewhere else, in the dark alleys of the big cities, perhaps, but never here, on the leafy avenues of a God-fearing community. 8-year-old Gretchen Harrington is the embodiment of that innocence. She is a spark of life, bright-eyed, her hair neatly combed, wearing a simple flowered sundress that caught the light as she stepped out of her front door on Woodland Avenue. It was the final day of summer Bible school, a morning that was supposed to be a celebration of faith and friendship. She had a short walk ahead of her, barely 3 blocks, a journey she had made dozens of times. The route from her house to the Trinity Church Chapel was a straight line through the heart of her neighborhood, a path lined with neighbors she knew and trees that offered a flickering shade. But somewhere in those few hundred yards, between the safety of her porch and the sanctity of the church steps, the world tilted on its axis. Gretchen Harrington stepped into a void. She didn't just go missing, she evaporated into the bright, blinding glare of a Friday morning. The walk was meant to be routine. In 1975, parents didn't hover. They didn't track their children with GPS or worry about the stranger in the white van. There was a communal trust that acted as an invisible shield. Gretchen's father, the Reverend Harold Harrington, was the pastor at Trinity, the very destination his daughter was headed for. He was already there, preparing for the morning's lessons, likely checking the hymnals or organizing the snacks, expecting to see his daughter's face appear in the doorway at any moment. But as the clock ticked past 9 a.m., the seat reserved for Gretchen remained empty. The initial minutes of her absence weren't filled with panic, but with a growing, nagging confusion. Perhaps she had stopped to talk to a friend. Perhaps she had been distracted by a stray dog or a blooming flower. But as the minutes stretched into a half-hour, the confusion curdled into a cold, sharp dread. Reverend Harrington looked at the other children, their faces bright and oblivious, and he realized the silence, where his daughter's voice should be, was becoming deafening. He made the first phone call home. His wife, Anna, answered, her voice trembling as she confirmed that Gretchen had left on time. She should have been there. She should have been safe. In that singular moment, the peace of Marple Township was shattered, replaced by a frantic, vibrating energy that would soon consume the entire state. The alarm was raised with a speed that reflected the community's sheer disbelief. This wasn't a runaway situation. 8-year-olds in sundresses don't just decide to leave their lives behind on the way to Bible school. By 10 a.m., the local police were on the scene, their sirens cutting through the heavy summer air, a sound that felt alien and violent in such a quiet place. The search began almost immediately, a desperate, sprawling effort that saw neighbors pouring out of their houses, some still in their morning robes, others dropping their garden shears to join the line. They moved in a human wave across backyards, peering into sheds, calling Gretchen's name until their throats were raw. The name Gretchen echoed through the streets, bouncing off the brick facades and the oak trees, but the only response was the relentless, rhythmic buzzing of the insects in the heat. There was no sign of a struggle. No dropped shoe, no torn fabric, no scuff marks on the pavement to indicate a fight. It was as if she had been plucked from the earth by a silent, invisible hand. The police began knocking on doors, their faces grim, asking the same questions over and over. Did you see a car? Did you see a stranger? Did you hear a scream? But the answers were always the same. No. Nothing. Just the quiet morning. At the center of this gathering storm was a man who seemed to be the very pillar of strength the community needed. David Zanstra, the 34-year-old pastor of the nearby Reformed Presbyterian Church, was more than just a neighbor. He was a family friend, a confidant to Reverend Harrington, and a co-organizer of the very Bible school Gretchen was attending. He was there, on the front lines of the search, his face a mask of pastoral concern and shared grief. He comforted the Harringtons, he led the volunteers, and he coordinated with the investigators. He was the one who could speak to the children, calming their fears while the adults searched the woods. To anyone watching, Zanstra was a man of God doing God's work in a moment of unimaginable darkness. He was the shepherd helping the flock navigate the valley of the shadow of death. No one could have known that the shepherd was wearing a mask. No one could have suspected that the man leading the prayers was the very person who had turned the neighborhood into a hunting ground. The irony was a jagged blade. The search for Gretchen was being guided, in part, by the very shadow that had swallowed her. As the first day wore on, the heat intensified, turning the search into a grueling, physical ordeal. State troopers arrived with bloodhounds, the dogs straining at their leashes, their noses pressed to the hot asphalt of Woodland Avenue. They picked up a scent at the Harrington house, followed it down the sidewalk. But then, near the intersection where Gretchen would have made her turn toward the church, the dogs began to circle in confusion. The scent trail didn't lead to the woods, and it didn't lead to the church. It simply stopped. It vanished in the middle of the street. To the experienced handlers, this meant only one thing. Gretchen hadn't walked any further. She had been picked up. She had entered a vehicle. The investigation shifted gears instantly. It was no longer a search for a lost child. It was a hunt for a predator. The stranger danger, era, though not yet named, was born in that moment on a suburban street corner. Every blue car, every unfamiliar face, every man sitting alone in a parked vehicle became a subject of intense, paranoid scrutiny. The police began a systematic check of every registered vehicle in the area, but the sheer volume of traffic in a suburban hub made the task monumental. The evening of August 15th brought no relief. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across Marple Township, the realization set in that Gretchen wouldn't be coming home for dinner. The church held a vigil, the pews packed with people whose faces were etched with a mix of sorrow and sheer, unadulterated terror. If a minister's daughter could be taken on her way to church, then no one was safe. The doors that had been left unlocked for decades were bolted shut that night. Parents pulled their children into their beds, holding them close, listening to every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind in the trees. The darkness outside felt predatory, thick with the unknown. In the Harrington household, the silence was a physical weight. Every time the phone rang, a jolt of hope and horror shot through the room, only to be followed by the crushing disappointment of another dead end or a cruel prank call. The community was paralyzed, caught in the grip of a mystery that felt both impossible and inevitable. The local media picked up the story with a fervor that bordered on the sensational. The cold case that would haunt Pennsylvania for nearly half a century was, in those early hours, a breaking news emergency. The headlines were blunt and terrifying. Search for girl. 8. Enters second day. Police fear foul play in Marple vanishing. Gretchen's school photo. A picture of a smiling girl with a gap-toothed grin and bright, intelligent eyes, was plastered on every television screen and front page. It became the face of a lost era. Investigators began to look into the creeps on the fringes, the drifters, the men with prior records, the loners who lived in the apartments on the edge of town. They interviewed hundreds of people, filling filing cabinets with notes and leads that went nowhere. They looked for the blue station wagon that one witness thought they might have seen, but the lead was thin, a ghostly memory that couldn't be pinned down. Amidst all this, David Zanstra remained a constant presence, a helpful witness who provided details about the morning schedule, acting as a bridge between the church and the law. He was so helpful, so ingrained in the fabric of the investigation, that he became invisible to it. The first 48 hours are the most critical in any kidnapping, and as that window began to close, the atmosphere in the township shifted from frantic energy to a grim, hollowed-out desperation. The search expanded into the dense, tangled woods of Ridley Creek State Park, a sprawling expanse of forest, ravines, and hidden creeks. It was a place where a person could disappear forever. Hundreds of volunteers hacked through the underbrush, their boots sinking into the mud, their eyes scanning for a flash of floral fabric or a displaced patch of earth. The state police helicopter circled overhead, its rhythmic thumping a constant reminder of the stakes. But the woods kept their secrets. The park, usually a place of recreation and beauty, had become a graveyard of hope. Every time a searcher stumbled or a dog barked, a collective breath was held, only to be released in a sigh of frustration. The mystery of Gretchen Harrington was no longer just a local tragedy. It was becoming a national wound, a symbol of the end of suburban safety. And yet, even in the depths of that first week, there was no inkling of the true horror that lay beneath the surface. No one suspected that the man of God, the one who led the prayers for Gretchen's safe return, was the same man who had watched her walk down that sidewalk, who had pulled his car over, and who had used his position of trust to lure her inside. The betrayal was so profound it was unthinkable. In 1975, the collar was a shield, an absolute pass that exempted a man from suspicion. As the investigation ground into a halt, and the days turned into a week of silence, the community began to mourn a girl they hadn't yet found, while the monster in their midst continued to offer them communion. The first part of this nightmare was ending, but the long, agonizing wait for the truth was only just beginning. The silence of Gretchen Harrington was about to become a permanent fixture of the landscape, a cold case that would wait 48 years for the light of day to finally break. By mid-September 1975, the frantic energy of the initial search had curdled into a heavy, suffocating malaise. The missing posters of Gretchen Harrington, once crisp and bright against the telephone poles of Marple Township, were beginning to curl at the edges, their colors bled dry by the relentless sun and the occasional late summer thunderstorm. The community was exhausted. The volunteers had returned to their jobs, the news cameras had begun to pivot toward other tragedies, and the Harrington family was left in a state of suspended animation, a purgatory where hope was a cruel, recurring dream. The investigation, once a hive of activity, was now a grind of paperwork and silent telephones. Every lead had turned to dust. The blue station wagon remained a ghost. The suspicious drifters had all been cleared. The neighborhood canvassing had yielded nothing but a collective, traumatized shrug. The silence that had swallowed Gretchen on Woodland Avenue was now spreading, covering the entire case in a layer of cold, impenetrable frost. But the earth has a way of surrendering its secrets when the seasons change. On October 14, 1975, 2 months after the disappearance, the weather had finally broken. The stifling humidity of August had been replaced by the crisp, biting air of autumn. In the remote, densely wooded reaches of Ridley Creek State Park, miles from the suburban safety of the Trinity Church, a jogger decided to venture off the paved trails, seeking the solitude of the deep forest. It was there, in a secluded ravine choked with fallen leaves and tangled briar, that the nightmare finally took a physical form. A flash of color amidst the brown decay. A skeletal hand reaching out from a shallow, hurried grave. The jogger didn't have to look twice. The scream that tore from his throat echoed through the trees, signaling the end of the mystery and the beginning of a 48-year horror story. The police response was instantaneous and overwhelming. The area was cordoned off, a yellow tape perimeter cutting through the silent woods. Forensic teams, working with the primitive tools of the mid-70s, began the grim task of excavation. They worked under portable floodlights as the sun went down, their shadows dancing like giants against the trees. What they found was a scene of clinical brutality. The remains were skeletal, stripped by the elements and local wildlife, but the evidence of a violent end was unmistakable. The skull showed signs of massive, blunt force trauma, fractures that spoke of a frenzied, heavy-handed attack. And then there was the clothing. The flowered sundress, once a symbol of a bright summer morning, was now a tattered, mud-stained rag, bunched around the small frame. It was the confirmation everyone feared, but no one wanted to voice. Gretchen Harrington was no longer a missing person. She was a homicide victim. The news hit Marple Township like a physical blow. The thin veneer of maybe she's just lost vanished, replaced by a raw, jagged grief that turned into a demand for blood. The discovery in the park changed the narrative from a kidnapping to a predatory execution. Why Ridley Creek? Why that specific, isolated spot? The location suggested someone with local knowledge, someone who knew the backroads and the hidden paths of the park, someone who could transport a child and a body without being seen. The investigators went back to the beginning, re-examining every witness statement with a newfound intensity. They looked for the where and the how, but the who remained a shadow. The crime scene provided no fingerprints, no DNA, which wouldn't even be a concept for another decade, and no weapon. The killer had been careful, or perhaps just incredibly lucky. In the midst of this darkness, the Harrington family had to face the unthinkable, burying their 8-year-old daughter. The funeral was held at the Trinity Church, the very place Gretchen was walking toward when she was taken. It was a sea of black suits and weeping neighbors. The air in the chapel was thick with the scent of lilies and the heavy, unanswerable question of why. Standing at the front of the church, offering words of comfort, was David Zanstra. He stood by the small casket, his voice steady, his eyes filled with a practiced, pastoral sorrow. He spoke of innocence and heaven, of a God who welcomes children, while the man who had crushed that innocence sat in the same room, perhaps even shaking the hand of the grieving father he had betrayed. The sheer audacity of the act was a masterpiece of sociopathy. Zanstra wasn't just hiding, he was performing. He was a lead actor in a tragedy of his own making, and the world gave him a standing ovation for his compassion. As the funeral ended and the cameras retreated, the investigation entered its most frustrating phase. The autopsy had confirmed the cause of death, but it offered no clues to the identity of the killer. The blunt object used to strike Gretchen was never found. The tire tracks near the dump site were too degraded to provide a specific make or model. Detectives were left chasing ghosts. They began a massive sweep of the area's known sex offenders, hauling men into interrogation rooms, leaning on them under the harsh glare of light bulbs, but none of them fit the profile of a killer who could snatch a girl in broad daylight without a single witness. The profile was wrong. They were looking for the monster under the bridge, the disheveled loner, the man with the scarred face. They weren't looking for the man in the pulpit. They weren't looking for the neighbor who checked in every day to see if there was any news. The weeks turned into months, and the months into the first-year anniversary. Each milestone was a fresh wound for the community. On August 15th, 1976, the town held a memorial. The fear hadn't left. It had simply moved indoors, becoming a permanent resident of Marple Township. Parents who used to let their children play until the streetlights came on now kept them on a short leash. The safety of the suburbs was revealed to be an illusion, a fragile glass ornament that had been shattered and could never be glued back together. The police files on Gretchen Harrington continued to grow, but they were filling with dead ends, tips from psychics, letters from confessors who were clearly mentally ill, and sightings of blue cars that led to innocent families. The case was cooling. The lead investigators were being reassigned to newer, fresher crimes. The box containing Gretchen's life, the sundress, the photos, the forensic reports, was moved from the active desk to the storage room. By the late 1970s, the world was moving on. The disco era arrived, the political landscape shifted, and the name Gretchen Harrington began to fade from the daily headlines. But in the Harrington house, The clock had stopped on that August morning. The room that belonged to an 8-year-old girl remained a shrine, a frozen moment in time. And just a few miles away, David Zandstra continued his life. He was a successful minister, a man respected by his peers, a father to his own children. He moved from the Reformed Presbyterian Church to a new calling in New Jersey, taking his secrets with him, buried under the weight of his vestments. He had gotten away with it. He had looked into the eyes of the police, into the eyes of the grieving parents, and into the eyes of his own congregation, and he had seen nothing but trust reflected back at him. The cold case status was officially applied as the 1980s dawned. The file was now a relic of a different era. The detectives who had worked the case originally were retiring, handing over the dusty folders to a new generation who looked at the black and white photos with a sense of detached tragedy. They saw a world they didn't recognize, a world without surveillance cameras, without cell phone pings, without the scientific magic of the modern age. They saw a crime that was unsolvable by the standards of the time. But the mystery didn't just sit in a box. It haunted the hallways of the Delaware County Police Station. It was the one that got away. It was the ghost that whispered to every rookie cop, "This could happen again, and you might not be able to stop it." The 1980s brought a new wave of missing children cases across America. Etten Patz, Adam Walsh, and the nation's collective anxiety reached a fever pitch. The Harrington case was often cited as an early example of this new, terrifying reality. But while the national conversation focused on stranger danger, the reality of Gretchen's death was far more insidious. It wasn't a stranger. It was the ultimate insider. As the decades rolled on, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, the technology finally began to catch up with the crime. DNA profiling became the gold standard. Cold case units were formed, specifically designed to apply new science to old bones. They looked at Gretchen's case again and again, but the physical evidence was too degraded, the samples too contaminated by the primitive handling of 1975. The science was failing them. The only thing that could break the case now wasn't a test tube or a microscope. It was a voice from the past that had been silent for 48 years, waiting for the courage to finally speak the truth about the man in the shadows. The 1990s and early 2000s passed like a slow-motion blur, a period of technological revolution that seemed to mock the stagnant silence of the Harrington file. While the world obsessed over the O.J. Simpson trial and the birth of the Internet, the box containing Gretchen's belongings sat in a climate-controlled storage facility, a time capsule of 1970s failure. Forensic science was evolving at breakneck speed. The discovery of PCR-based DNA testing meant that a single skin cell or a microscopic drop of dried blood could, in theory, identify a killer. But for the Marple Township detectives, the excitement was tempered by a grim reality. The 1975 crime scene had been a product of its time. The remains had been exposed to the elements for 2 months, and the clothing had been handled by dozens of people without gloves. The golden snitch of DNA was proving to be a ghost in the machine. Every time a new forensic technique was announced, a detective would pull the Harrington file, hope surging in their chest, only to realize the samples were too degraded, the chain of custody too broken. The case wasn't just cold, it was frozen in a block of ice that no modern lab could melt. Meanwhile, David Zandstra was living a life of quiet, professional triumph. He had moved his family from Pennsylvania to Plano, Texas, and later to Marietta, Georgia. In every new city, he rebuilt his kingdom. He was a man of impeccable credentials, a graduate of prestigious seminaries, a gifted orator, and a man who exuded a calm, paternal authority. In the churches he led, he was beloved. He was the one who mediated marital disputes, the one who baptized newborns, the one who sat by the bedsides of the dying. To his congregations, he was a vessel of divine grace. No one in Marietta, Georgia, looked at the silver-haired pastor and saw the man who had once stood over a shallow grave in Pennsylvania. He had successfully compartmentalized his soul, burying the memory of the flowered sundress so deep that it arguably ceased to exist in his daily consciousness. He was a master of the holy disguise, using the respectability of his office to ensure that no one ever looked at him with anything resembling suspicion. But while Zanstra was building his legacy, the children of the 1970s were growing up. The young girls who had attended that Bible school in 1975 were now women in their 50s and 60s, carrying with them the latent, unexamined traumas of their youth. In the suburban psyche, the Gretchen Harrington story was a foundational myth, the moment the world became dangerous. For one woman, a childhood friend of Zanstra's own daughter, the memory wasn't just a news story, it was a personal shadow. For decades, she had repressed a specific, unsettling encounter she'd had with the kind Pastor Zanstra during a sleepover at his house. As the years turned into decades, the memory began to leak through the cracks of her daily life. It wasn't a memory of murder, but a memory of a predator's touch, a moment of boundary crossing that felt wrong even then, but which she lacked the language to describe as a child. She began to realize that the man the world saw as a saint was, in the privacy of his own home, something else entirely. In 2023, the silence finally broke. It started with a phone call to a cold case investigator, not a tip about a car or a witness to the 1975 kidnapping, but a survivor coming forward to report a past abuse. The woman, now in her late 50s, sat down in a quiet room and told her story. She spoke about the sleepovers, the way Zanstra would linger in the doorway, the way he would touch her in ways that made her skin crawl. It was the prior bad act that investigators had been waiting for nearly half a century. It provided something more valuable than physical evidence, a psychological profile. For the first time, the pastor label was stripped away and a predator was revealed. This woman's courage acted as a catalyst. Detectives began to look at Zanstra not as a grieving family friend, but as a suspect with a hidden history of grooming and exploitation. They realized that if he was capable of this, he was capable of anything. The investigation moved with a sudden electric speed. The Delaware County District Attorney's Office, working with local police, began a deep dive into Zanstra's movements in 1975. They re-interviewed the original 1975 witnesses, but this time, they asked different questions. They didn't ask, "Did you see a stranger?" They asked, "Did you see David Zanstra?" And the answers began to change. They found a witness from the original file, a teenager in 1975, who had mentioned seeing Gretchen talking to a man in a car that looked like Zanstra's, but whose testimony had been dismissed because, at the time, the pastor was beyond reproach. The pieces of the puzzle, scattered for 48 years, were finally being pulled together by a gravitational force of truth. The preacher's shadow was finally being mapped, and the outline was terrifyingly precise. In July 2023, 2 detectives from Pennsylvania traveled to Georgia. They didn't go with a warrant, they went with a plan. They found David Zanstra, now 83 years old, living a comfortable, retired life. He was a frail old man in a suburban home, a grandfather, a pillar of his neighborhood. When they knocked on his door, they didn't see a monster. They saw a man who had spent a lifetime pretending. They sat him down in an interview room, and for hours, they danced around the edges. They talked about 1975. They talked about the Harringtons. They watched his eyes. Zanstra was calm, at first. He played the role of the helpful, elderly witness one last time. But then, the detectives pivoted. They brought up the woman's testimony. They brought up the inconsistencies in his 1975 statements. They let the silence in the room grow heavy, the same kind of heavy silence that had hung over Marple Township for 48 years. Then, the crack appeared. It wasn't an explosion of guilt, but a slow, weary surrender. Faced with the knowledge that his secret was no longer just his, Zanstra's facade crumbled. In a flat, clinical voice, the man of God began to describe the devil's work. He admitted to seeing Gretchen walking that morning. He admitted to pulling his car over. He admitted to luring her inside with the promise of a ride to the church, the very church where her father was waiting. He described the drive to the woods, the refusal of the child to do what he wanted, and the sudden, violent outburst that ended her life. The confession was a cold, surgical strike to the heart of the community. He spoke of the blunt object, the shallow grave, and the way he had simply driven back to town to lead the search for the girl he had just killed. The sheer, unmitigated evil of the act was laid bare in a Georgia interrogation room, 48 years after the first drop of blood was spilled. The confession sent a shockwave through the nation. It was the cold case of the century finally coming to a close, but the closure felt like a fresh wound. The news broke on a Tuesday morning, the headline screaming, "Preacher charged in 1975 murder. The monster in the pulpit." In Marple Township, the reaction was a mixture of vindication and profound horror. The Harringtons, now elderly, were finally given an answer, but it was the most painful answer possible. The man they had trusted, the man who had prayed with them, was the man who had stolen their daughter. The betrayal was total. It wasn't just a crime against a child. It was a crime against the very idea of faith and community. The case was no longer about a missing girl. It was about the masks people wear and the darkness that can hide in the brightest of places. The confession was not an ending. It was an autopsy of a community's trust. As the tape rolled in that Georgia interrogation room, the elderly man with the thinning hair and the steady pulse dismantled the myth of the good neighbor piece by piece. David Zanstra didn't just admit to the murder. He detailed the mechanics of a betrayal so calculated it bordered on the supernatural. He spoke of the opportunity. He saw the girl, he knew the schedule, and he knew that his car was a sanctuary, not a trap. In his mind, he wasn't a predator in that moment. He was a man taking what he felt entitled to. The chilling part for the investigators wasn't the violence of the act, but the normalcy that followed. Zanstra described how he smoothed his clothes, checked his reflection, and went back to his life as if he had simply finished a mundane chore. He didn't hide in a basement. He stood in the light, shaking the hands of the very police officers who were looking for him. This was the pastor's privilege, a cloak of perceived holiness so thick that it blinded everyone to the blood on his hands. The legal machinery of Delaware County, dormant for nearly half a century regarding this case, roared back to life with a vengeful energy. Extradition papers were filed within hours. The sight of Zanstra being led into a Pennsylvania courtroom, shackled and wearing an orange jumpsuit, was a visual rupture in the timeline of Marple Township. He was 83 years old, a frail shell of a man, yet he carried the weight of a monster. The courtroom was a pressure cooker of emotions. Families who had lived in the shadow of the 1975 vanishing sat in the pews, their eyes fixed on the back of the preacher's head. There was no room for the usual legal theater. The evidence was the man's own voice, a recorded confession that echoed through the marble halls, stripping away any possibility of a wrongful accusation. The defense's only card was the passage of time, the idea that a man this old, this removed from the crime, shouldn't be subjected to the rigors of a trial. But the prosecution was relentless. Justice doesn't have an expiration date, and Gretchen Harrington never got to grow old. As the details of the investigation went public, the scope of the horror expanded. It wasn't just about Gretchen. The 2023 statement from the woman in Georgia had opened the floodgate. Investigators began looking into every parish Zanstra had ever served, from Pennsylvania to California to Texas. They started receiving calls. Dozens of them. Women, now in their 50s and 60s, spoke of incidents. They spoke of a pastor who used his office to groom, to isolate, and to silence. A pattern emerged of a serial predator who used the church as his personal hunting ground, a man who viewed his congregation not as a flock to be protected, but as a resource to be exploited. The Gretchen Harrington murder was no longer seen as an isolated flash of madness. It was the inevitable conclusion of a lifetime of unchecked predatory behavior. The church, an institution built on the foundations of truth and protection, was forced to confront the fact that it had provided the perfect cover for a wolf in sheep's clothing. The impact on the religious community was a seismic shift. In Marple Township and beyond, the Zanstra revelation sparked a painful reckoning. How could a man like this be ordained? How could he be promoted? How could the signs have been missed for 50 years? The Reformed Presbyterian Church and other denominations Zanstra had touched were forced to issue apologies that felt hollow against the backdrop of a murdered 8-year-old. The case became a textbook example of the halo effect, a cognitive bias where our overall impression of a person influences how we feel and think about their character. Because Zanstra was a man of God, his actions were interpreted through a lens of benevolence. If he was seen near the woods, he was praying. If he was seen with a child, he was mentoring. The realization that the community's own faith had been weaponized against them was a trauma that many found impossible to process. Inside the Harrington family, the news was a double-edged sword that cut through 3 generations. Gretchen's father, the man who had shared a pulpit and a friendship with his daughter's killer, had to grapple with a betrayal that defied language. To forgive is a central tenet of the faith they both practiced. But how do you forgive a man who sat at your dinner table while your daughter's body was decomposing in a ravine because of his hands? The solved status of the case didn't bring peace. It brought a secondary explosion of grief. The what-ifs that had haunted the family for 48 years were replaced by the "how could he?" The closure was not a warm blanket. It was a cold, hard floor. The Harringtons became the face of a specific kind of American tragedy, the family that waited a lifetime for an answer only to find that the answer was a nightmare they had been living next to all along. The media coverage of the trial was a frenzy, a true crime obsession that gripped the nation. It was a story that had everything: a vanished child, a decades-long mystery, and a villain who was the literal definition of a pillar of society. But beneath the sensational headlines was a deeper, more unsettling narrative about the fallibility of human systems. The 1975 investigation was picked apart by modern experts, revealing the gaps where Zanstra had slipped through. The lack of communication between jurisdictions, the deference shown to the clergy, and the primitive state of forensic collection were all laid bare. The trial wasn't just a judgment of David Zanstra, it was a judgment of an era that allowed men like him to flourish in the shadows of the sanctuary. As the proceedings moved toward a plea, the tension in Delaware County reached a breaking point. There would be no dramatic jury verdict. The evidence was too overwhelming, the confession too airtight. In a final, grim act of judicial finality, Zanstra stood before a judge to enter his plea. The cold case label was officially retired, replaced by a life sentence that, for a man of 83, was a death warrant by another name. But the end of the legal case was just the beginning of the cultural haunting. The ghost of Gretchen Harrington, finally identified and her killer named, didn't simply vanish. She became a symbol of all the silent victims, all the cases still sitting in boxes, and all the predators still hiding behind the respectability of their professions. The solved stamp was red, the color of blood, and the color of a final, agonizing truth. The gavel fell, but the echoes didn't stop. With David Zanstra finally behind bars, the 1975 cold case was technically solved, but the psychological debris left in its wake was a mountain that Marple Township would be climbing for decades. This wasn't just a win for the cold case unit. It was a devastating revelation that forced every resident to re-examine their own history. The preacher's shadow had been cast over every baptism, every wedding, and every Sunday service Zanstra had performed since that bloody August morning. For the survivors, the women who had been groomed, the children who had felt that same unsettling presence, the arrest was a validation of a lifetime of suppressed intuition. They weren't crazy. They weren't imagining things. They had been in the presence of a predator who had perfected the art of the holy camouflage. This case became the definitive study in the halo effect, a psychological blind spot where we assume that because a person is good in one high-profile area like religion or community leadership, they are incapable of darkness in private. In the world of modern criminal profiling, the Harrington case shifted the paradigm of how cold cases are prioritized. It proved that the most dangerous predators aren't always the ones with a profile of social failure or obvious mental instability. Zanstra was a high-functioning predator, a man who utilized social status as a primary hunting tool. Investigators across the country began looking at their own unsolvable files with a new lens, looking not for the drifter in the park, but for the man who organized the search party. The case highlighted a terrifying reality in profiling, that some killers don't devolve or get caught because they are sloppy. They survive because they are so deeply integrated into the fabric of the community that they become the very people tasked with finding the victim. This hidden in plain sight phenomenon became a cornerstone of modern cold case training, emphasizing that a suspect's respectability should be treated as a potential red flag rather than a shield. The legacy of Gretchen Harrington also became a catalyst for legislative change. The Gretchen's Law movement gained momentum, pushing for the elimination of statutes of limitations on all crimes against children, regardless of how much time has passed. The fact that a woman's memory from the 1970s was the key to unlocking a 2023 conviction proved that the passage of time is often just a waiting period for justice, not an expiration. Law enforcement agencies began implementing trauma-informed interviewing techniques, recognizing that victims of child abuse often carry the keys to major crimes for decades before they feel safe enough to speak. Gretchen's story transformed from a cautionary tale about walking alone into a powerful mandate for institutional transparency. It forced churches, schools, and youth organizations to dismantle the cultures of silence that protect the men of God at the expense of the children in their care. But for the Harrington family, the legacy was far more intimate and painful. The closure didn't bring Gretchen back, and it didn't erase 48 years of wondering. It replaced a mystery with a nightmare. The family's journey became a study in complicated grief, where the resolution of a crime brings a secondary trauma of betrayal. They had to learn how to exist in a world where the man who held their hands in prayer was the same man who had crushed the life out of their daughter. The church on Woodland Avenue, once a place of sanctuary, was now a site of profound spiritual injury. Yet, in the face of this, the community found a strange, resilient strength. They began to build a new kind of trust, one not based on blind deference to authority, but on a collective commitment to watching out for one another. The safety of 1975 was gone, but in its place was something harder, more realistic, and ultimately more protective. As the months passed following Zanstra's sentencing, the Marple Township Police Department finally moved the Gretchen Harrington file from the active drawer to the closed archives. It was a thick, weathered stack of paper, thousands of pages of dead ends, false hopes, and 1970s-era field notes. The final page was a simple report from the Georgia interrogation room, a cold, clinical end to a half-century of heat. But the case remained a living file in the hearts of the town. Gretchen wasn't just a name on a docket anymore. She was a reminder that the truth is a patient hunter. The 1975 cold case was solved, but its lessons were just beginning to be learned by a world that had spent too long looking for monsters in the dark, failing to realize that sometimes they're the ones holding the light. The conviction of David Zanstra in 2023 was a forensic anomaly. In an era where true crime fans have been conditioned to expect a DNA smoking gun or a high-tech digital footprint, the Harrington case was solved through the most ancient and volatile of tools, the human memory. This was a DNA-less victory, a rarity in the modern judicial system that sent ripples through the legal community. Prosecutors were forced to build a bridge across a nearly 50-year chasm using nothing but the fragile threads of testimony and a confession that many feared would never come. This brought to light the last witness phenomenon, the terrifying reality that in cold cases this old, the clock isn't just ticking on the evidence, it's ticking on the people. Every year that passed, the pool of individuals who could testify to the events of August 1975 grew smaller. Detectives weren't just racing against a killer's mortality, they were racing against the biological erasure of history itself. The forensic challenge was staggering. By 2023, the physical evidence from the Ridley Creek Ravine was effectively a ghost. The sundress had been improperly stored in the 1970s. The biological material had been contaminated by the touch of countless investigators before the concept of cross-contamination was fully understood. The soil samples were gone. The blunt object was never more than a theory. To secure a conviction, investigators had to pivot from biology to psychology. They utilized behavioral sequencing, a method of mapping Zanstra's life before, during, and after the crime. They tracked his signature behaviors, the grooming patterns, the abuse of pastoral authority, the way he inserted himself into the investigation. This wasn't about a lab result. It was about building a narrative so airtight that a jury, and eventually the suspect himself, would see the inevitability of the truth. It was a victory for old-school detective work, proving that while DNA can identify a killer, only a relentless pursuit of behavioral patterns can dismantle a predator's life. As the case moved from investigation to the archives, it highlighted the ghost lead problem that plagues cold cases. In the thousands of pages of the Harrington file, the name Zanstra appeared hundreds of times, but always as a witness, never as a suspect. This revealed a systemic failure in 1970s investigative logic, the inability to see past a person's social utility. Because Zanstra was helping the police, he was categorized as a tool of the investigation rather than a target. Modern profilers now call this the investigator's blind spot. Zanstra had effectively hacked the system by becoming part of it. He attended the police briefings. He knew which leads were being followed. He knew which woods were being searched. He was a predator who had been given a seat at the table where his own capture was being discussed. The 2023 resolution forced a massive reevaluation of how helpful witnesses are screened in active missing child cases today. The conviction also shed light on the statute of silence, the cultural and institutional pressure that prevents victims of clergy abuse from coming forward. The woman whose 2023 testimony broke the case had carried her secret for 48 years. She hadn't stayed silent because she forgot. She stayed silent because the world of 1975 offered no place for her truth to land. Zanstra's position in the church was a fortress. To accuse him back then wasn't just to accuse a man, it was to attack the very foundation of the community's moral order. The case became a powerful case study in the delayed disclosure of trauma. It proved that the time it takes for a victim to speak is often proportional to the power of the person who harmed them. The legal victory in Pennsylvania was as much about the evolution of societal belief as it was about the discovery of new facts. Ultimately, Part 6 of this narrative is about the limits of science and the power of the human voice. In the end, the most sophisticated labs in the world couldn't do what one brave woman and two determined detectives did in a quiet room in Georgia. They broke the spell of the preacher's shadow. They showed that while the physical world may decay and the tracks may wash away, the truth has a way of remaining hot long after the trail has gone cold. The Harrington case serves as a grim warning to those who think they can outrun their past. Time doesn't heal all wounds. Sometimes, it just gives the truth enough space to finally catch up. The handcuffs didn't just close around the wrists of an old man in Georgia. They triggered a seismic event that rippled across the entire American landscape, tracing the decades-long itinerary of a predator hiding behind a cross. As the news of David Zanstra's arrest broke, a map began to take shape, a dark geography of the American heartland. From the quiet suburbs of Pennsylvania to the sprawling developments of Plano, Texas, and finally to the manicured neighborhoods of Marietta, Georgia, the holy man had left a trail of broken trust that was only now being illuminated. In every town he touched, the reaction followed a hauntingly familiar pattern: initial disbelief, followed by a sickening realization. In Plano, the church archives were thrown open, and the ghosts of the past began to speak. The stories that emerged were chillingly consistent. The special attention given to certain children, the isolation under the guise of spiritual guidance, the subtle grooming that parents, blinded by the collar, had mistaken for pastoral care. Zanstra hadn't just moved to follow a calling. He had moved to stay ahead of the whispers, utilizing the vast, decentralized network of the church to reset his clock every few years. This was the institutional alibi in its most lethal form. In every new city, Zanstra arrived with a clean slate and a glowing recommendation. The church wasn't just his employer, it was his character witness, a global corporation of faith that provided him with a new set of victims and a fresh cloak of invisibility. The aftershocks of his confession revealed a devastating truth about how we protect our institutions at the expense of our individuals. In the 1980s and 90s, as he rose through the ranks of various congregations, the red flags were there: small, localized complaints, parents who felt uneasy, children who suddenly didn't want to attend youth group. But in the absence of a centralized database, these red flags remained isolated incidents, never coalescing into a pattern. Zanstra exploited the silo effect of religious governance, knowing that a secret kept in Pennsylvania would never reach the ears of a deacon in Texas. He was a nomad of the sanctuary, a man who understood that the most effective way to hide a crime is to bury it beneath the perceived virtue of a new beginning. The aftershocks were not just institutional, they were deeply personal for the thousands of congregants who had looked up to him. For 48 years, people had brought their deepest shames and brightest joys to this man. He had performed the sacred rites of passage, the baptisms that were supposed to cleanse, the weddings that were supposed to unite. Now, those memories were tainted, retroactively poisoned by the knowledge of what he had done in that Ridley Creek ravine. It was a spiritual, slow-burn trauma. People looked at their family photo albums, at the pictures of Zanstra smiling next to their children, and felt a physical revulsion. The preacher's shadow wasn't just a metaphor. It was a cold, dark stain that had spread through the history of every community he served. The Gretchen Harrington case became the primary argument for a radical shift in how religious organizations vet their leadership. It was no longer enough to be a man of God. You had to be a man whose past was no longer a series of unexamined voids. As the investigation widened, the geographic cure, the idea that a predator can be fixed by simply moving them to a new location, was exposed as a deadly fallacy. Zanstra hadn't changed. He had simply refined his technique. The details of his later life suggested a man who had become emboldened by his own survival. He had outlived the detectives who first hunted him. He had outlasted the initial outrage of the 1975 disappearance. He believed he was untouchable. But the aftershocks proved that the truth doesn't just sit still, it accumulates. The 2023 arrest was the final collapse of a house of cards that had been built across half a century and 4 states. The silence was finally being replaced by a roar of accountability, a desperate, collective attempt to fortify the future against the next Zanstra. The lesson was written in the blood of a girl in a flowered sundress. Darkness doesn't dissipate with distance. It only waits for the next place to call home. When the heavy steel door of the detention center slammed shut, sealing David Zanstra into a 6 by 8 foot concrete box, the world waited for the crack. They expected the 83-year-old grandfather to collapse under the weight of his sins, to weep, to beg for a redemption that only the God he preached about could offer. But the breakdown never came. Instead, the man who had worn the collar for half a century adjusted to his cage with a terrifying, flat, affectless calm. This was the final, chilling reveal of the anatomy of a sociopath. Zanstra didn't pace, he didn't scream. He simply sat, hands folded, exhibiting the same eerie composure he had shown at the pulpit and at the funeral of the girl he murdered. To the forensic psychologists observing him, this wasn't shock. It was the mask of sanity in its purest, most durable form. He wasn't a man crushed by guilt. He was a man annoyed by the inconvenience of being caught. The true horror of Zanstra's mind lay in his mastery of compartmentalization. This is the psychological mechanism that allowed him to strangle a child in the morning and comfort her grieving father in the afternoon without a single tremor in his voice. To the average person, the human mind is a single vessel where actions and conscience bleed into one another. But for Zanstra, his mind was a house with many rooms, and the doors were locked from the outside. He could step into the killer room, commit an atrocity, step out, lock the door, and immediately enter the pastor room, where he genuinely believed in his own righteousness. He didn't just hide the truth. He deleted it from his operating system whenever it didn't serve him. In his warped internal logic, the murder of Gretchen Harrington wasn't a defining act of evil. It was merely an incident, a regrettable lapse that had been handled and filed away, irrelevant to the grand narrative of his good works. This clinical detachment revealed a narcissism so profound it defied gravity. Even as he confessed, investigators noted a distinct lack of empathy for Gretchen. He spoke of the crime not as a tragedy for a lost life, but as a series of tactical errors on his part. He described the mechanics of the abduction, the car, the drive, the the weather with the dryness of a man reading a grocery list. There were no tears for the 8-year-old girl terrified in the woods. There was only a focus on his own survival, his own urges, his own story. He viewed other people, even children, not as autonomous beings with souls, but as props in the stage play of his life. Gretchen was an object to be used. The Harringtons were an audience to be managed. The police were obstacles to be outsmarted. The pastor persona wasn't a calling. It was the ultimate camouflage for a predator who needed constant access to vulnerable prey and unearned trust. Inside the prison walls, stripped of his vestments and his titles, Zanstra attempted a grotesque pantomime of his former life. Reports surfaced of him trying to counsel other inmates, offering spiritual advice to men half his age. It was a pathetic, desperate attempt to re-establish the hierarchy that had protected him for decades. He couldn't exist without being the authority, the one looking down from the high ground. But prison is a brutal meritocracy, and a child killer, regardless of his collar, sits at the very bottom. The inmates didn't see a reverend. They saw a monster. The illusion he had crafted for 48 years evaporated under the harsh fluorescent lights of the cell block. He was left with nothing but the raw, ugly truth of his own nature. A small, hollow man who had spent a lifetime stealing light to fill his own darkness. The anatomy of a sociopath concludes not with a bang, but with a whimper of banal evil. Zanstra represents the terrifying reality that monsters don't look like monsters. They don't have horns or scarred faces. They have gentle smiles, they have pockets full of candy, and they have the keys to the church. He died as he lived, not as a repentant sinner seeking forgiveness, but as a manipulator who was simply out of moves. The psychological legacy he leaves behind is a warning to every community. Never mistake charisma for character, and never assume that the man holding the Bible isn't capable of breaking every commandment written inside it. The mask didn't slip. It was ripped off, revealing that beneath the man of God, there was never anyone home but the predator. The silence of 1975 was a physical thing. It was bound by geography, limited by the range of a radio signal or the circulation of a local newspaper. When the news trucks packed up and left Marple Township in the late 70s, the story of Gretchen Harrington effectively ceased to exist for the rest of the world. It became a local ghost story, whispered over backyard fences, but invisible to anyone outside the county lines. In the analog era, a predator like David Zanstra could rely on the tyranny of distance. If he moved 3 states away, he was effectively moving to a different planet. There was no search engine to query his name, no digital footprint to trail behind him like a tin can tied to a bumper. He could reinvent himself in Texas or Georgia because the information highway was a dirt road and the bridges were burned behind him. He banked on the world forgetting. He banked on the entropy of paper files rotting in damp basements. But he didn't account for the digital resurrection. The internet didn't just change the way we communicate, it changed the physics of memory. As the 21st century roared into existence, the Gretchen Harrington case was pulled from the darkness of the archives and uploaded into the immortal cloud of the true crime community. It started slowly, a scanned newspaper clipping on a genealogy forum, a mention in a blog post about unsolved mysteries of Pennsylvania, a thread on a message board dedicated to cold cases. But these digital breadcrumbs began to coalesce. The armchair detective phenomenon was born, a sprawling, decentralized army of citizens who refused to let the dead stay buried. They weren't bound by jurisdiction or budget cuts. They were fueled by obsession and a hunger for justice. In living rooms across America, people who had never set foot in Marple Township were studying maps of Ridley Creek, analyzing old witness statements, and keeping the name Gretchen in the algorithm circulation. This digital vigilance created a new kind of psychological siege for men like Zanstra. For decades, he had lived with the quiet confidence that his secret was safe. But in the age of Google, anonymity is a myth. Every time a new podcast covered the case, every time a YouTube channel featured a deep dive into the 1975 vanishing, the spotlight swept back over the timeline. The case wasn't just sitting in a box, it was being litigated daily in the court of public opinion. While the police investigation had gone cold, the digital investigation was running hot. Online forums became repositories for details that official reports might have overlooked. The memories of former neighbors, the anecdotes of people who lived in the area, the cross-referencing of other incidents. The internet acted as a collective consciousness, a hive mind that was constantly connecting dots that a single detective, working alone in 1985, could never have seen. The power of this digital resurrection lay in its ability to destroy the silo effect. In the past, a victim in Georgia would have no way of knowing about a victim in Pennsylvania. They were islands of trauma, separated by hundreds of miles and decades of silence. But the internet built bridges between these islands. It created spaces where the survivors of Zanstra's grooming could potentially find one another, or at least find the validation that their unease wasn't unique. When the news of the case began to trend, it wasn't just information, it was a signal flare. It told every person who had ever crossed paths with David Zanstra, look again, remember again. The safe harbor of his past was being eroded by the relentless tide of information. He could no longer hide behind the obscurity of the pre-digital age, because the pre-digital age was being digitized, indexed, and scrutinized by a generation that demanded answers. This environment was the fertile soil in which the final breakthrough grew. The woman who eventually came forward in 2023 didn't exist in a vacuum. She lived in a world where cold case wasn't a synonym for forgotten. She lived in a culture that had begun to prioritize the voices of victims, a culture that used hashtags and viral threads to demand accountability from institutions that had long been dormant. The digital pressure cooker kept the heat on the Delaware County District Attorney's office. It reminded them that the public was watching, that the story wasn't over. It created a mandate. We know she is still out there. We know he is still out there. The internet didn't solve the case. Detectives did that, but the internet ensured that the case was never allowed to die. It deprived Zanstra of the one thing a killer needs most after the crime: silence. Moreover, the digital resurrection transformed the geography of the crime scene itself. Satellite imagery and drone footage allowed people to explore Ridley Creek State Park from their laptops in London or Tokyo. The dense woods where Gretchen's body was found were no longer a hidden, local secret. They were a mapped coordinate in the global consciousness of crime. This transparency stripped the killer of his power. He wasn't a phantom haunting a mysterious forest. He was a man who had committed a cowardly act at a specific latitude and longitude that was now pinned on 1,000,000 screens. The demystification of the crime scene was a crucial step in reducing the killer's stature. He was dragged from the shadows of folklore into the sharp, high-definition light of data. And there is a terrifying irony for the predator in this digital age. While Zanstra spent his later years trying to curate a legacy of a pious, grandfatherly figure on social media, posting photos of family gatherings, church events, the mundane pleasantries of a retired life, the internet was simultaneously building the dossier that would destroy him. His own digital footprint, however small, confirmed his location, his movements, his existence. He was posting updates about his life, while the web was slowly tightening the noose around his past. The collision of these two worlds, the false narrative he presented online and the true narrative the internet was unearthing, was inevitable. When the truth finally broke, the internet did what it does best. It archived the fall. It ensured that the image of David Zanstra would never again be that of a benevolent pastor, but would forever be linked to the mugshot, the confession, and the name Gretchen Harrington. The digital resurrection serves as a stark warning to every cold case subject still breathing free air. The clock isn't just ticking, it's recording. The files are no longer gathering dust. They are gathering views, likes, shares, and scrutiny. The forgotten victims have an army now, a legion of strangers who will keep their names trending until the door is kicked down. For Gretchen, the internet became the vigil that never ended, the candle that never burned out, proving that in the modern world, you can kill a person, but you cannot kill the story. The signal is too strong. The network is too vast, and the memory of the cloud is infinite. Marple Township is a collection of beautiful homes, a patchwork of green lawns and brick facades that suggests the very best of the American dream. But for 48 years, it was a town that forgot how to breathe. To drive through its streets in the decades following 1975 was to drive through a crime scene that had never been cleared. The yellow tape may have been removed, the police cruisers may have returned to their patrols, and the seasons may have turned the leaves from green to gold a dozen times over, but the psychological air remained thin, tainted by a particulate matter of fear that settled into the lungs of every resident. The disappearance of Gretchen Harrington wasn't just a news story, it was a psychological climate change event. It marked the precise moment when the barometer of suburban life dropped and a permanent storm front moved in. Before August 15, 1975, the doors were left unlocked, the keys were left in the ignition, and the children were free-range, exploring the boundaries of their world until the streetlights hummed to life. After August 15th, the world shrank. The boundaries were pulled in tight, restricted to the backyard, then the porch, and finally behind the double-locked door. This was the birth of the Gretchen generation. These were the children who were 8, 9, and 10 years old when their classmate vanished. They're the ones who are now in their late 50s, the ones who grew up with the phantom of the blue station wagon checking their rearview mirrors. They were the first generation to be raised in the shadow of the stranger danger panic, a doctrine that was preached not just in schools, but at the dinner table, in the playground, and, ironically, from the pulpit. They were taught that the world outside their front door was not a playground, but a hunting ground. The simple act of walking to school, once a rite of passage and a daily adventure, was transformed into a tactical operation. The buddy system wasn't a suggestion, it was a law written in the invisible ink of trauma. Parents became wardens of their own anxiety, gripping their children's hands with a white-knuckled intensity that communicated a clear message: you are not safe. I cannot protect you enough. The sociological impact on Marple Township was a low-grade siege that lasted half a century. The architecture of the community began to change in subtle, defensive ways. Fences that were once decorative became functional barriers. The neighborhood watch signs that sprouted on telephone poles weren't just civic pride, they were warnings. The trust that holds a community together, the ability to assume the best of your neighbor, was eroded by the acid of suspicion. If a minister's daughter could be snatched on her way to Bible school, then no one was above suspicion, and no child was immune. The monster was no longer a fairy tale creature living under a bridge. He was a real, tangible threat that could be driving the car next to you at the stoplight. This fear seeped into the groundwater of the town. It changed the way people looked at newcomers. It changed the way people looked at the woods of Ridley Creek State Park. The park, a jewel of natural beauty, became a place of foreboding, a no-go zone, in the collective imagination where the trees whispered secrets they refused to tell. But the tragedy of the Gretchen generation is deeper than just a fear of strangers. The 2023 revelation that the killer was David Zanstra, the smiling pastor, the family friend, the leader of the search, delivered a second, perhaps more devastating, psychological blow. For 48 years, the town had directed its fear outward. They had scanned the horizon for the drifter, the criminal, the other. They had built their defenses against the unknown wolf circling the perimeter. When the truth finally broke, it revealed that they had been guarding the wrong door. The wolf hadn't broken in. The wolf had a key. He was inside the house. He was the one telling them to be careful. This realization shattered the foundational myth of their safety. It meant that all the precautions, all the stranger danger lectures, all the suspicion directed at the unknown, had been a misdirection. The danger wasn't lurking in the shadows of the unknown. It was standing in the blinding light of the sanctuary, wearing a robe and holding a hymnal. This specific betrayal created a complex, layered trauma for the community. It wasn't just grief, it was a retrospective violation of their history. The adults who had been children in Zanstra's care had to rewind the tapes of their own lives. They had to look back at the summer camps, the Bible study groups, the rides home in the pastor's car, and reinterpret those memories through the lens of a predator's proximity. The hand on the shoulder that felt fatherly in 1976 now felt radioactive in 2023. The kind words of encouragement now sounded like the grooming tactics of a sociopath. This is a form of moral injury, a deep, soul-level wound that occurs when an authority figure violates their sacred duty. The town had to reconcile the fact that they had broken bread with a murderer, that they had allowed him to comfort them, that they had unknowingly validated his mask. The shame of not knowing is a heavy burden, even when there was no way they could have known. It is the survivor's guilt of a whole township asking, why her? Why not me? And how did we let him walk away? The silence of the suburbs is often mistaken for peace, but in Marple Township, the silence was a holding pattern. It was the sound of a community waiting for the other shoe to drop. When the arrest was announced, the release of tension was explosive, but it didn't bring immediate relief. Instead, it brought a flood of anger. The cold case label had allowed a certain emotional distance. It was a mystery, a tragedy of fate. The solved label made it a crime of specific, calculated malice. It gave the grief a target. The anger was directed not just at Zanstra, but at the institutions that shielded him, at the era that enabled him, and at the sheer, unfair passage of time. Justice delayed by half a century feels less like victory and more like an apology, note delivered to a graveyard. The town realized that Zanstra had stolen more than just Gretchen's life. He had stolen the peace of mind of thousands of people. He had stolen the innocence of an entire era. He had lived a full life, sunsets, holidays, milestones, on borrowed time that belonged to an 8-year-old girl. In the aftermath of the confession, Marple Township began a painful process of redefinition. The story of Gretchen Harrington had defined them for so long. They were the town of the missing girl. Now, they were the town of the pastor killer. It is a grim legacy to inherit. But within this darkness, there was a flickering resilience. The residents, old and new, began to come together not in fear, but in a shared resolve to reclaim their narrative. The memorial services held in 2023 were different from the vigils of 1975. They weren't desperate pleas to a silent sky. They were affirmations of truth. The community gathered to say her name, not as a question, but as a declaration. Gretchen. She was no longer a ghost story. She was a girl who mattered, whose truth was finally louder than her killer's lies. The Gretchen generation found themselves in a unique position. They were the keepers of the memory. They were the ones who could tell the younger generation, the ones who only knew the story from podcasts, what the air felt like that morning in August. They became the historians of the trauma, ensuring that the lesson wasn't lost. And the lesson changed. It shifted from fear everyone to trust your instincts. It shifted from don't talk to strangers to speak up when the powerful make you uncomfortable. The legacy of the case moved from a passive state of victimhood to an active state of vigilance. The parents of 2023 Marple Township still hold their children's hands, perhaps just as tightly as their parents did, but they do it with eyes wide open, knowing that safety isn't a guarantee provided by a zip code or a church steeple, but a constant, communal effort of watching out for one another. The physical landscape of the town remains largely the same. The trees on Woodland Avenue are older, thicker, casting longer shadows. The Trinity Church still stands, its brick facade a stoic witness to history. But the feeling on the street has shifted. The invisible weight has lifted, replaced by the clarity of the truth. It is a scar, certainly. Marple Township will always be scarred. But a scar is better than an open wound. A scar means the bleeding has stopped. A scar means the skin has knit back together, tougher and less pliable than before. The town that forgot how to breathe has finally exhaled. It was a long, ragged breath, 50 years in the making, expelling the toxic air of the unknown. They are breathing again, not the innocent, shallow breaths of 1975, but the deep, measured breaths of a survivor who has looked the devil in the face and outlasted him. As the sun sets over the rooftops of Delaware County today, the playground swings are still moving.
Children are still laughing.
Life, with its stubborn, relentless momentum, has continued. But if you listen closely to the wind in the oaks of Ridley Creek, you can hear the change. The woods are no longer keeping a secret. The darkness has been evicted. The fear that once paralyzed the community has been transmuted into a solemn, unshakable memory. The Gretchen generation has grown old, but they have fulfilled their silent vow. They didn't forget. They didn't let the world move on without an answer. And in doing so, they reclaimed their home from the shadow of the preacher. The siege is over. The gates are open. And while the innocence is gone forever, the truth, cold, hard, and undeniable, has finally come home to stay. 48 years. That is the distance between a scream and a verdict. It is a measurement of time that defies easy comprehension. In 48 years, empires fall, borders are redrawn, technology rewrites the definition of what it means to be human, and entire generations are born, grow old, and die. But for the Harrington family, and for the haunted community of Marple Township, 48 years wasn't a timeline of progress. It was a single, suspended breath. It was a pause button pressed on a summer morning in 1975 that was only released in the summer of 2023. The resolution of this case didn't just close a file. It collapsed a half-century of waiting into a singular, devastating moment of clarity. The air feels different now. The heavy, humid silence that hung over Woodland Avenue has finally been broken by the ring of justice, a sound that is both triumphant and mournful. But when the gavel strikes and the news cameras turn away, what remains? It isn't found in a police report or a court transcript. It is found in the quiet spaces, in the way a community remembers a girl who loved the summer, and in the stubborn, unyielding light that refused to be buried in a ravine. Ridley Creek State Park is quiet today. The seasons have done their work, covering the scars of the 1970s with layer upon layer of fallen leaves, new growth, and the indifferent beauty of the natural world. To a stranger walking the trails, the ravine is just a ravine, a dip in the earth, a place of shadows and moss. But places have memories, too. For decades, this spot was a black hole, a gravity well of horror that people avoided without knowing why. It was the place where the preacher thought he had hidden his sin. He believed that the earth would swallow his secret, that the leaves would cover his tracks, and that the silence of the woods would be his accomplice. He was wrong. The earth remembers. The ravine wasn't a vault, it was a waiting room. It held the truth in its cold embrace, preserving the story until the world was ready to hear it. Today, the ravine is no longer a graveyard of hope. It is the site of a revelation. The darkness that lived there has been evicted, dragged out into the harsh light of a courtroom, leaving the woods to finally be just woods again. The birds sing the same songs they sang in 1975, but the listener hears them differently now. They are no longer the soundtrack to a mystery, but the chorus of a piece that has been hard-won. The story of Gretchen Harrington is a testament to the patience of truth. In our modern world, we are addicted to speed. We want crimes solved in 48 hours. We want justice to be swift and linear. But true justice operates on a geologic timescale. It is slow, grinding, and often invisible. It works in the conscience of a witness who stays silent for decades until one night, she can't sleep. It works in the mind of a detective who retires, but keeps a copy of the case file in his desk drawer. It works in the digital cloud, where data points float aimlessly until they collide to form a picture. David Zanstra bet his life on the idea that the truth has an expiration date. He believed that if he lived long enough, if he moved far enough, if he prayed loud enough, he could outrun the past. He thought that an old man couldn't be punished for the sins of a young man. But the truth is a patient hunter. It doesn't need to run. It just needs to wait. It waited while he preached his sermons. It waited while he bounced his grandchildren on his knee. It waited while his hair turned white and his step grew slow. And when he was at his most comfortable, when he thought the finish line of his life was within reach, the truth stepped out from the shadows and placed a hand on his shoulder. It whispered, "I am still here." And then there is Gretchen. In the frenzy of the investigation, the trial, and the media circus, it is easy to lose sight of the center of this universe. We talk about the victim, the body, the case. But Gretchen was not a case file. She was a daughter. She was a sister. She was a spark of kinetic energy in a flowered sundress. She was the potential of a woman who never got to exist. We mourn not just the 8 years she lived, but the 48 years she was stolen. We mourn the graduations she never attended, the career she never chose, the family she never built. We mourn the empty chair at the Harrington table that stayed empty through 5 decades of Christmas dinners. But while Zanstra stole her future, he failed to extinguish her presence. In a strange, powerful way, Gretchen Harrington grew up to be a giant. Her silence became a roar that changed laws. Her absence became a presence that forced a community to look out for one another. She became a guardian spirit for every child walking alone, a reminder that vigilance is an act of love. The man who killed her wanted to erase her, to turn her into nothing. Instead, he turned her into a symbol of everything that is precious and worth protecting. He made her immortal. The light in the ravine is not a physical light. It is the illumination of memory. It is the candle that her family burned in their hearts when the world told them to move on. It is the refusal to let the cold case label become a tombstone. There is a profound dignity in this refusal. To remember a murdered child for half a century is an act of defiance against evil. It says, "You took her life, but you cannot take her name." The community of Marple Township and the thousands of strangers online who took up her cause became the keepers of this flame. They proved that a secret can be kept by one man, but the truth is carried by the many. The digital resurrection we spoke of wasn't just about algorithms and databases. It was about human connection. It was about a woman in Georgia reading a story about a girl in Pennsylvania and realizing that they were sisters in trauma. It was about the collective realization that we are all responsible for the safety of the vulnerable. The light that finally broke the case didn't come from a police spotlight. It came from the combined glow of thousands of people refusing to look away. David Zanstra will die in a prison cell. He will be a number in a system, stripped of the unearned reverence he wore like a costume. His legacy is one of ashes. He will be remembered not as a pastor, but as a predator. Not as a man of God, but as a man who used God to hide from himself. His name will forever be a footnote in the story of the girl he killed. History has a way of correcting the scales. The good man is revealed to be the villain, and the silent victim is revealed to be the hero. When he is gone, the world will not mourn. The cell door will close, and the silence that follows will be the final, fitting judgment on a life built on lies. But Gretchen's name will continue to be spoken. It will be spoken in the legislation that protects children. It will be spoken in the training of detectives who learn that the most dangerous suspect is often the one smiling at the press conference. It will be spoken by parents who tell their children, "Be safe, be smart, and know that you are loved." As we close the book on the 1975 cold case, we are left with a lingering resonance. It is the feeling of a heavy weight being lifted, but also the ache of the bruise that remains underneath. We cannot fix the past. We cannot unring the bell. We cannot give the Harringtons back the daughter they lost in the summer of '75. But we can give them the truth. And in a world often defined by chaos and ambiguity, the truth is a precious, rare commodity. It is the only thing we have that can stand against the darkness. The solved stamp on the file is red, the color of blood, but also the color of the heart. It signifies that the system, flawed and slow as it may be, did not forget. It signifies that no matter how deep the grave, no matter how high the pulpit, there is no shelter for the wicked. Imagine for a moment the timeline as a piece of string. On one end, there is a bright August morning in 1975, a girl walking to church. On the other end, there is an old man in 2023 signing a confession. For 48 years, that string was pulled tight, vibrating with tension, with fear, with the unknown. Now, the string has been cut. The tension is gone. The ends have fallen away. What is left is the space in between, the story. It is a story of horror, yes, but it is also a story of endurance. It is the story of a mother's love that outlasted a killer's life. It is the story of a detective's promise, kept a generation later. It is the story of a town that faced its own shadow and survived. So, tonight, as the sun goes down over the manicured lawns of Marple Township and the streetlights flicker to life one by one, there is a sense of finality. The monsters are real, but they can be caught. The night is dark, but the dawn always comes, even if it takes 48 years to break. We leave Gretchen Harrington not in the ravine, not in the cold earth, but in the light. We leave her in the memory of a summer that never ended. We leave her at peace, finally found, finally known, finally home. The case is closed. The file is shelved. But the light burns on. Good night, Gretchen.